Hello everybody and welcome to Disney World Playlist. This is the series in which I kind of want to take a different look at the attractions and the places to eat here in Walt Disney World. And so the idea is each episode a theme or concept is proposed, and then sort of a little mini itinerary for the day at Disney is put together around that idea with attractions and places to eat that I think sort of, take up that theme and really fulfill the idea of that theme. And this week, I was originally going to do colors because I think that was a really cool subscriber suggested theme, and I still will hopefully do that in the future. But a lot of people were asking for a nostalgia playlist, and I thought that was really interesting just because it seemed like a very challenging playlist to put together. For the main reason that nostalgia is such a subjective, sensation, right? What I might be nostalgic about is not the sort of thing that you'd be nostalgic about necessarily. And so how do you put together a playlist that I think could maybe not universally, but widely be seen as nostalgic? Now, I think the low-hanging fruit, the easy option here would to just pick a lot of opening day attractions that have been around since the 70s, but I'm not going to go down that path for today's playlist. In fact, I think that's a little too easy. So what I'm going to be doing is what I think is a theme, a playlist of attractions that I think represent or in some way involve the theme of nostalgia within themselves. And a new thing I'm going to be doing for the series, starting with this episode, is I'm going to try and mention a hotel to stay at that I also think fits this theme. I don't know if the hotel is here on MC Magic. I think they've got the All-Stars, but that's not the one we're going to go with. In fact, for our nostalgia playlist, we're going to be staying at Disney's Pop Century Resort. And it makes sense, right? Pop Century is a resort that, celebrates all of the past decades of the last century. It is in itself a very nostalgic resort, whether or not you've lived through those decades, because it just completely involves itself with finding parts of those decades that people loved and celebrating them. So we're going to stay at Pop Century. We're going to head off. The other thing I did for this playlist, I don't know if I'm going to do it for all playlists, but I'm going to do it for this one, is I sort of reorganized everything so it seems a little, at least, logical. Past playlists, I was jumping around. I was going from, like, Epcot to Magic Kingdom back to Epcot again. Here we're going to try and lump them together. And we're at the Magic Kingdom for the first part of the day, and we're going to head on over to Tomorrowland, which, surprisingly, it's the futuristic part of the park that is also, I think, the most nostalgic. And that is here at Walt Disney's Carousel of Progress. It makes perfect sense, right? The attraction itself is about nostalgia. It is a 4-scene, or I guess technically a 5-scene if you count the intro, stage show with animatronics that dips into the past and celebrates how great life seemed to have been during those eras. And it starts with the turn of the century going in 1900, and then it goes through like the 30s and the 50s, and eventually it ends with, I guess you could call it the 90s. But at the time it was the futuristic, it was almost a look into the future. But to give a little historical context, this attraction was made in the 60s for the New York's World Fair. So even though today, nobody who rides the Carousel of Progress is going to personally remember what it was like at the turn of the century for 1900, because they're too old at that point. This is over 115 years ago. Back in the 60s when this attraction first opened, there were people. It was not a crazy idea to think that there'd be like grandparents or older folk who would get on the attraction and could remember those times. So it was very much an attraction built on the concept of nostalgia. And we look back at, all the new technology at the time, like the electric light bulb and the ice box, and how great that made life. And that is just, I think, in the truest form in all of the parks here, the most nostalgic attraction, despite the fact that I think most of us watching here cannot personally remember any of these eras except for the last scene, which was the 90s. Maybe some of the older viewers, the one before, but it's falling off. But it doesn't change the fact that this is an attraction that is so nostalgic and just, I think it's the perfect, like, it was the first ride I thought of when I thought of this playlist. So Carousel of Progress, #1 stop on our nostalgic playlist. So after the Carousel of Progress, we actually head back towards the entrance to visit Main Street USA. Now this might be a stretch because it's not like totally an attraction per se. It's not a ride. You don't sit down. There's no shows. It's a bunch of stores. But as far as nostalgia goes, I think Main Street is way up there with Carousel of Progress because it is Walt's personal ode to Marceline, Missouri, and what he remembered growing up with. So while it's not the sort of part of the park that I would say is nostalgic for us, since most of us, I can't speak for everyone, but I assume most of us weren't around in middle America, turn of the century. But it was built, I think, not purely, but heavily on the idea of nostalgia. It really looks back at that time with rose-tinted glasses, as nostalgia typically does, and celebrates all of the parts of this old-timey, Americana, cut of life that I think makes this a very nostalgic, part of the playlist. And I also wanted to expand the playlist so it wasn't just rides, but I think Main Street in itself, without being a show or an attraction, could be, a thing to do to, go to Main Street. Whether you're just, shopping from store to store, or you're checking out the watches, or you're grabbing some snacks at the front, or even just sitting down and people watching, or waiting for one of the street shows to end up going on. There's a lot to do in Main Street, and it's definitely one of these parts of the parks where you don't want to just, bolt on down to the castle and head to your favorite attraction. You want to take your time, you want to wander and peruse a little bit and enjoy it because it's a very enjoyable experience. It also leads off to where we're going to eat for the first time today, and that is Casey's Corner, famous hot dogs. I've included this in past playlists, and I think, it blends in with a lot of what I just said about Main Street, which is, this is meant to be sort of, reminds me of old-timey baseball, out during, on a Sunday and, having some hot dogs or corn dogs. And again, it's one of these places where I think very few of us can personally feel a sense of nostalgia because this isn't a part or type of life that we have experienced because it is so old and hasn't been around for so long. But I think its creation, its upkeep, its inspiration is nostalgic at its core, so I think it is very deserving of being on a nostalgia playlist, and I think it'd be a great place to eat. Just there's something, maybe I'm speaking out of the fact that it's February and it's freezing in New York right now, but the idea of sitting down on a warm Sunday summer afternoon and having a hot dog and some soda, that just sounds like the best thing ever, and I've just made myself super hungry and super cold. Anyway, we are going to head on over to a new theme park to tackle the next half of this nostalgia playlist. Next up, we head on over to Disney's Hollywood Studios and we check out the Tower of Terror. Now, you might be thinking, why is this on a nostalgia playlist? It's, relatively speaking, still a new ride. It was made in the mid-90s. It isn't, it isn't one of these attractions that have been around since Disney's inception in the 70s, or Disney World's inception in the 70s. So why is it a nostalgic playlist? Well, I think if you think about the plot and premise of the Tower of Terror, it is a very nostalgic attraction. Look at this building, for one. This is a rundown, old, decrepit building that saw its golden era in, the golden era of Hollywood, which was the 1930s. And the premise is that you are sort of entering the Twilight Zone to explore the past of this legend, or this myth of these characters who got stuck in an elevator and it got hit by lightning and they disappeared and went into the Twilight Zone. And I think conceptually the idea that you are trying to revisit this past, you're trying to go somewhere that used to have this golden era that doesn't any longer, to, explore more or to find out what was going on. I think that is very nostalgic in nature. Not on a personal level. We have not been in 1930s Hollywood. Maybe some of you have, and that would be really awesome if you're watching this video. But I think for the most part, we cannot personally relate to this at all. But I do think, as a concept, the idea is you are revisiting. And, to be fair, this entire boulevard and avenue and half of the park, to be honest, is a loving, ode to an era that is very far gone, and one that, it celebrates the golden era of Hollywood. You can almost say the park itself is very nostalgic, although it's changed a lot over the years. But I think the Tower of Terror especially carries those themes. So that's why I think the Tower of Terror would be a really good pick for a nostalgic playlist. Now, the next attraction we're going to head on over to is actually not that far away. And of course, our next attraction is the Great Movie Ride. I think this was a no-brainer, right? As far as the park goes, in fact, this probably should have gone ahead of Tower of Terror. This is an attraction that really, really celebrates the history of film. It celebrates that golden era of film and motion picture in a way that I think nothing else here in the park really does. Think about all the attractions you're revisiting there. You've got the old classics like the Busby Berkeleys, and you've got the old crime films and the Wizard of Oz, and just everything about that is, even down to Fantasia. I think the most contemporary film in the attraction is Alien, and of course that has a weird history about it, which is why it's there. So I think this is a very nostalgic attraction. Think of the queue and how not only are you showing props from films, although they show props, I think, these days from more contemporary films, but, you have that queue room with the classic trailers playing. I mean, this is an attraction that very much is meant to make you feel good about the movies and make you remember the films. You've got Indiana Jones, which is also pretty contemporary. So you've got films in there that people riding today will remember, watching as a kid if you're an older adult. And then you've got that montage at the end, which is like the ultimate celebration of the film industry and movies. And of course, mostly old movies, some newer movies in there. But I think overall this attraction, from the queue, from the ride itself, from the montage at the end, from the fact that the area outside here has all of the hand and footprints of the stars, the Hollywood stars, sort of mimic how they do it in Hollywood. I think all of that is just a celebration of a part of Hollywood that we all remember fondly and love and like to think about from time to time. So I think this is a very nostalgic attraction. And then for dinner, we're going to head on over to the 50s Primetime Cafe. Now, I originally would have picked the Sci-Fi Dine-In Theater. I think both are pretty interchangeable, but I've been throwing the Sci-Fi Dine-In into a lot of playlists, so I'm going to try and, lay off it a little bit. But the 50s Primetime Cafe, I mean, oh man, this is the most nostalgic restaurant, I think, in the entire Walt Disney World Resort, right? The whole premise of this restaurant is it's made to be like the 1950s kitchens, right? With the waitresses acting like your aunts, and you've got mom in the kitchen, and, you've got all of the televisions playing old school TV shows. It is meant to be a love letter to, that Leave It to Beaver style Norman Rockwell version of America and what, eating in a kitchen like that was. And again, this is, goes back to a reoccurring theme, which is this isn't a nostalgia that I think a lot of us can relate to. I think this one more so than the others. I think people like my parents' age can definitely remember this era and what it was like growing up like this. But I think this isn't meant to personally feel nostalgic, but to show this loving care to, nostalgia that the people who made it felt. And this is an era that I think they look back very fondly of. And beyond that, really good food and a really great dining experience. So overall, I mean, it's a win-win-win. It fits the playlist, good food, good atmosphere, very, very nostalgic. Reminds me of an era I never got to grow up or live through, but one that it almost makes you wish you did because they, give it such loving treatment. And then we're going to end the day here in Epcot over at Spaceship Earth, which I think culturally as a civilization is very nostalgic, because the attraction at its core is the history of communication, human communication, from when we were cavemen hunting mammoth to, building computers in a garage and who knows what the future will bring. I think that is, a very, I think it's nostalgic, and I think I picked this because when you think about nostalgia, the idea is you're looking back at the past with fondness. And when you think about Spaceship Earth, all of the scenes that this attraction depicts, I don't think any of them are necessarily dark or, like depressing. I guess there's a little period they talk about the Dark Ages, which I guess very almost by its name is dark, but, for the most part, it is a celebration of what we've been able to do as a civilization to learn how to communicate with each other and how to grow as a civilization as a result of that. And so I think while this isn't nostalgic in the sense that we're going to think back on it, and I don't even think it's nostalgic in the sense that somebody, 50 years ago would look back with nostalgia, but I think this is almost like one giant step back, and it's a humanity's nostalgic look at civilization. And as an honorable mention, I think a lot of original Epcot attractions had this flavor about it, whether it was Horizons, which talked about what we thought the future was going to be like. There's that little scene with the Jetsons. We thought everything was going to be like the 50s in space. Or World of Motion, which has a very humorous look back at the history of transportation. I just think in general, Epcot was very well-rounded in that it took a fond look back at what we thought the future was going to be like in one way or another, and then went on to talk about what we thought it could be like in the actual future. Anyway, there you have it. That's my nostalgic playlist. As you can see, not a lot that I personally relate to in terms of nostalgia, but that I think anybody looking at can appreciate from the perspective of nostalgia. What I would like to know is, what would go on your nostalgia playlist? Whether it's places to eat, attractions to go to, shows to see, hotels to stay at, let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know if you have an idea for a playlist. Like, this one was suggested by many subscribers. I think the next few that I'm going to do are going to be based on subscriber suggestions, so feel free to throw them out there. Feel free to agree or disagree with any of my picks. Have a great week, whatever you're doing. Make the most of it. If you want to reach me, I can be reached on Twitter @RobPlays. And I hope to see you next time for the next episode of the Walt Disney World Playlists.